Hi guys, George with Troglodyne here with a quick follow-up to the last video I did, which was about how the interview process goes and why it is that storytelling is so important, not only to the interview process, but all over the entire software development ecosystem. And it made me realize that, since my theme this week is basically I'm telling war stories, I might as well tell you guys about times I've blown interviews, man, right? So when it really comes down to it, the sort of big maiden narrative that I had that made me blow a lot of things throughout my entire life was what's called nice guyism, which is essentially you're hiding your faults from people, right? You're being overly, I wouldn't say obsequious, but willing to please. And people can tell when you're very willing to please. When usually it's because you're necessitous, and they see it as deceptive. Okay, in that you're not showing faults because you want something from them, and people can really pick up on this very fast, right? And the thing is, it's actually true. Whenever you're almost always, whenever you see people who are putting on this uh, sort of facade of I am perfect, I make no mistakes. The reality is that's not true because no one's perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. And you just can't suspend your disbelief when you're actually dealing with other people. Now, if you were literally a Marvel comic book character, maybe. But no, this is normal people. We're all just, normal average guys or above average guys, but everyone makes a mistake. It doesn't matter. And so every time that I have failed an interview, it's usually because of some kind of selective dishonesty with regard to, uh, and I wouldn't even call it selective dishonesty because if it's selective, that means you're going to be honest about your faults at least once, right? And so it's more like a comprehensive dishonesty is the easiest way for you to blow an interview. And it's just comprehensive dishonesty on one point or another, right? So you are going to eventually be asked about your failures, right? You're going to be asked, okay, well, tell me about a situation where you had a dispute with a coworker, or tell me about why you got fired that one time, And I've got more than that one time that I got fired, right? So, you sort of have to be very honest about it. And a lot of times that's very hard in that if your mental model about hiding your defects is actually deeply ingrained within you, a lot of people get that. Uh, it's very difficult for you to actually understand why it is you actually really got fired or why it is that the interaction you had uh, failed to work. It takes a lot of introspection, and a lot of people are just not willing to do that kind of introspection necessary to find out why they failed so they stop failing, right? um, During my life, every time I've gotten fired, it's basically been for the same thing, and it's always uh, I'm just not willing to put up with something that the cultural norms of the company say that I should put up with. And that's just how it is. I have stayed at companies for like 4 years and 8 years before. So companies change over time a lot. Okay. Cultural drift is a real thing. And I'm going to talk about that in one of my upcoming videos. But long story short is that if you don't adapt to this and you keep sticking around, eventually it's going to bite you in the butt. And you're going to have a choice as to whether or not you're going to maintain the sort of standards that you used to have with regard to the way you talk to people, or whether you're going to have to adopt the new standard, which in my opinion, adopting the new standard is basically never worth it because you have standards for a reason. It's so people don't walk all over you or cause trouble like that. And a lot of the times when you have this sort of nice guy mindset where you're trying to hide flaws, you almost never enforce boundaries because, again, you're willing to please, right? And so, a lot of times, if you enforce a boundary, all of a sudden everyone really gets bent out of shape because you've never done this before and they see it as incongruent with who you are. And so, despite the fact that what you got fired over was probably a dispute about nothing, it got escalated really quick because they saw it as inconsistent with the way that you had interacted with them up to that point, right? In that everything that they'd done, or you'd done, everything was fine before this. Why all of a sudden is it a big problem? They think that there must be something all of a sudden wrong with you, when the problem may actually be that the company itself started to change rather than you changing. And so the point is, you need to identify these things so that you can use it as a means to disarm this skepticism in whoever you're interviewing with, so that they stop thinking about the sort of things that they're going to think about, which is, okay, I'm trying to disqualify this guy, right? Uh, when people instead give you a little piece of a little dangle of disqualifying material, but they don't act like it's disqualifying, then a lot of people, they just immediately buy that, and trust starts getting built, right? Because it's one of those things. Well, I learned from it, so hey, it worked out, right? And you can move forward like that and make a lot of progress. I'm not saying here that you need to dwell on your failures, because people really, really don't like that. That will even more quickly burn your interview, in that they just see that you're not focused positively, because you have to have a positive focus when you're doing this stuff. And that's how you have to frame your failures, is that ultimately it's positive in that I learned X or Y or Z, right? So that's essentially the problems that I had in my life. Was, I would say, oh, you can, the most obvious one is like, oh, I've never really had a problem with my coworkers or anything like that, which that really just says that you're so obsequious that you're never ever going to enforce a boundary. You're never going to take a risk. You're never going to do anything like that. And a lot of people, they pick up on that very fast. The other thing you can say is like, just sort of dance around the issue and not really say what actually happened. Um, in fact, in that case, it's just so easy to pick up on that you might as well just tell a lie, and an obvious one, because people will trust that even more than a obvious dancing around the issue. Especially the more ridiculous it is, the better. But rather than be like some people who were famous for doing that, in that they're just spinning webs of lies nonstop and no one can really take them seriously. That's not what you want in an interview. You generally want them to feel like they actually have sort of some basis to actually stand on, rather than this guy is quicksand. I have no idea whether I'm coming or going with this guy. You need to instead, build that firm platform of, okay, well, here's where this happened, here's what happened, and here's why I failed, and here's what I'm doing different to make sure this doesn't happen anymore. And most of the time, these failures, they are nipped in the bud in the first place by just enforcing strong boundaries with regard to who you work with. Um, had I done that in most of these situations, it wouldn't have been a problem in the first place. Breaking things like power laws with regard to like outshining your master, or saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, essentially all you're doing there is violating their boundaries, and that can easily get you fired, right? So you need to set boundaries within yourself sometimes to say, no, I'm not going to do that, because that obviously gores somebody's ox that doesn't need to be gored, right? It's just not your role at the firm to do that, right? That's I've been fired twice now, essentially for speaking out of turn, shall we say? the It doesn't matter if you're right. In fact, it's actually worse if you're right, because that cuts doubly deep, right? Um, and so you have to recognize that there's a lot of situations where you're going to be right and management is going to be wrong, and you can't do anything about it, and you're just going to have to suck it up or move firms. Which actually, that's the ideal thing to do, is when you see that the direction of the firm is not actually consistent with success, you need to get out of there, because the reason it's getting that way, there's very little you as a employee can do about that, because that pathology is actually originating from somewhere far above where you're actually able to deal with it. You can't generally cure an organization from the bottom up. It has to be cured from the top down. So those are some mistakes I've made in my youth, and in saying like, The VP's strategy is like literally insane and can't work. you know, that's a pretty good way to get yourself fired, right? The other things are like, imposing a boundary on something is somebody where it's like, oh, somebody gets offended and you're like, okay, whatever, I'm just going to not talk about this and I'm going to try and like make my communications purely professional from now on with these people because I can't discuss things like we're friends or something like that. If you've never done that before, all of a sudden they'll just think you're being a dick and cutting them off rather than doing what is sensible and not social loafing in first place, right? And keeping it 100% professional all the time. Uh, I think a lot of people fall into that trap these days, and that work is sort of a substitute for a social gathering place as church has lost relevance and other sorts of in-person gatherings continue to gradually lose relevance in our very extremely online age. Um, so you have to recognize that that can be a trap for you and not treat things in the unprofessional manner. And by unprofessional, I mean you're trying to be friends with the people you work with. Uh, Again, that's great. It's great to have friends at work, but eventually you're going to be put into another group of people. You will be moved around, and you can't treat them as friends right off the bat because that is what you're going to be tempted to do. And you're going to cross a boundary. And then the question is, so what are people expecting you to do when you cross a boundary? Do they expect you to back down? Do they expect you to continue to enforce your boundary and say, no, I mean, this is what I'm used to, and blah, 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 blah. And, it turns out a lot of people are going to be on hair triggers and you can't deal with it and there's nothing you can do about it, so you're going to be knocked out if you do that. It's best to just not even get into that problem in the first place by keeping these parts of your life separate, right? So those are sort of the mistakes that I've made. It's, basically number one, acting out of turn, and number two, acting out of turn, because it's essentially you're acting in a role that you're not supposed to be acting in. That's the easiest way to get fired, right? It's insubordination. It is goring the ox of the powerful. It is getting too friendly with the people you're working with, and taking liberties with regard to the sorts of things you can discuss with the people around you, and then that gets you in trouble. And it's just more or less, I've found that I've gotten in trouble multiple times and not gotten fired. It really seems to be more like a, how is your boss feeling? If he feels like he needs to, throw somebody up against the wall and make an example of him, well, it was your turn in the barrel, son. So there is going to be an element of luck, but it's better for you to not get into the situation where you have to deal with the luck in the first place. And when you do, the best advice is the same advice I give to everyone else. It's one of those, at that point, it's like, okay, am I being detained? I need to shut up and lawyer up, right? Most of the time, it's not going to be the other half where it's like, I got to lawyer up. And it's, except in extreme circumstances where it's like, the reason I'm being fired is because the boss is telling me to do literally illegal things. I know guys who have had to do that too. Uh, but generally, it's just going to be like, okay, look, I understand that there's only one way that this can go, because once you've started a path of escalation and you're not trying to get a path of de escalation, it's pretty obvious that this is only going to go in one direction, and you just need to shut up and stop digging the hole. Sometimes things will blow over like that, but sometimes they won't blow over. And, whether or not you dig a hole, they're just going to go and dig and look for reasons to get rid of you, because, again, everyone has plenty of reasons to get rid of you. It's just a matter of going and digging. And things like Slack or new workplace chat platforms have made that easier than ever to do. It's the whole notion of at will employment is sort of meaningless nowadays, because everybody has these surveillance systems that gives everyone 1,000 reasons to get rid of anyone. I mean, nobody can be perfect. The amount of time necessary, nobody has that kind of iron fortitude to not ever do anything that is beyond reproach with regard to one person's perception or not. Now, you can always say something inappropriate. You can always cross a boundary because you're not a mind reader. And so these things are going to happen. You're going to have to accept that they happen in your life. And your best ways to insulate yourself from that is to, number one, understand your role and don't ever get outside the role. Just stay there, be Mr. Professional. I'm not going to do anything outside of that, and just, I'm Mr. Hired Gun, and get over it. And the other half of that is knowing when your time is up, knowing when you've been there too long. A lot of this is going to really help you with regard to your earning potential as well, because you generally need to move on after about 4 years if you're going to maximize your earning potential. You either need to do that or you need to get a counter offer. But even then, there's multiple sources out here have talked over the years about you need to move on whether or not you get a counter offer, because it's a ticking clock from that day, really, until they find a reason to get rid of you. Because uh, like it or not, they're going to think you're disloyal. Even if you were loyal and you just felt like you needed more money, they're going to resent it. It's just a fact of life. When they're not going to resent you coming in from out of the blue and all of a sudden hooking them up in massive and exciting ways, and they feel like, you're worth the money. So that's basically my spiel about how you can blow your interviews and how I've blown my interviews over the years. It's just how it works. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be blowing them like that anymore, because I know certainly the problems I've had in the past. I'll be blowing them in new and exciting ways, man. So like the video, subscribe to my channel, and you'll hopefully find even more Titanic disasters coming your way soon. Bye, guys. If I can figure out how to turn off OBS, that